It's Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense and happy last day of winter. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, we are going to be talking about the possibility of a deal to end the war in Ukraine and what's actually happening here. Now, before we get to that, I want to say that I know there's been a lot of movement in the courts and on immigration, and all of that will be covered in Friday's episode. I didn't want to make today's episode a two-parter with Ukraine and immigration because I think both of these issues deserve their own deep dive episodes. But today, let's get to what's happening in Europe. So on Tuesday this week, President Trump had a 2.5-hour long conversation on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, initially, Putin had said that he would agree to a 30-day ceasefire on energy and infrastructure in Ukraine as long as Ukraine agreed to that as well. That's not really what Ukraine wants. We'll talk about their side of this in a second here. But what we're talking about is things like pipelines and power lines and power plants, but Putin refused to give up any more than that. And we'll get to why this deal isn't actually Putin giving anything up at all in a minute. But here's what Trump said about that phone call with Putin on Fox News in a taped interview.
It was a fairly optimistic take. Vladimir Putin agreed to a ceasefire immediately on energy and infrastructure, right, but not to a 30-day ceasefire. Tell us what happened.
Well, you have a situation where you have a lot of guns pointing at each other, foolishly, because it would have never happened if I were president. That was not a war that was supposed to happen, and it did happen. So that's where we are. And right now, you have a lot of guns pointing at each other, and a ceasefire without going a little bit further would have been tough. Russia has the advantage, as you know. They have encircled about 2,500 soldiers. They're nicely encircled, and that's not good. And we want to get it over with. Look, we're doing this. There are no Americans involved. There could be if you end up in World War III over this, which is so ridiculous. But, you know, strange things happen. And I think we had a great call. It lasted almost 2 hours. Talked about a lot of things and toward getting it to peace. And we talked about other things also.
Now, as Trump was talking with Putin on Tuesday, Ukrainian advisors were meeting with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, in Saudi Arabia, where Ukraine said it would agree to a 30-day full-stop ceasefire if Russia also did. Now, today, Trump posted online that he had about an hour-long conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, where they mostly talked about his conversation with Putin in what he said were, quote, in terms of their requests and needs from both countries. And he added, we are very much on track. Now, the full ceasefire deal is what the White House has been pushing Ukraine to make, despite Zelensky making it clear that he doesn't trust Putin's word because he's broken at least one ceasefire in the past. But Zelensky has really been trying to stay in line with what the Trump administration wants him to do after that Oval Office ambush at the end of last month. And the U.S., because Zelensky has been in line with them, has promised to restart military aid that Ukraine absolutely needs. So while Zelensky was at least open to the idea of a 30-day ceasefire on energy proposed by Russia, he said in a statement just the assertion and the word of Putin that he will not strike energy sites is too little. And he said if they all agree to this opening ceasefire, he wanted more assurances from the U.S. that we would monitor at least a list of energy sites that Ukraine wants protected, or it would mean the end of a ceasefire if Russia attacked them. He also said on Wednesday, for us, a red line in the recognition of Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories as Russian, we will not agree to that. And what he means is essentially what Putin has wanted from this entire war. For more than a decade now, Putin has said that he thinks Russia is still entitled to the countries that were a part of the former Soviet Union, beginning with Ukraine. And giving into that idea is something that American leaders right now have, to be generous, toyed with in the past. Just last month, J.D. Vance and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth were on a trip to Europe, and Hegseth said this.
We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling Allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective.
What Hegseth said there was met with a lot of criticism from our allies, as far as they are now, in Europe, because allowing Russia to take territory from a country that isn't theirs and does not belong to them anymore means that the U.S. is absolutely willing to step back from protecting our European allies. But while all of these things in this Russia-Ukraine negotiation look like they're forcing a peace, or at least forcing movement in peace talks, they're a long way off. Because just hours after Putin promised that he wouldn't bomb civilian energy sites, he did. Russia bombed a Ukrainian power plant in a city of about 100,000 people, despite the Kremlin saying Putin had ordered a stoppage to the bombing, which was obviously a lie. Now, Zelensky said on Twitter today that Putin effectively rejected the proposal for a full ceasefire by this bombing, meaning that it would be right for the world to respond by rejecting any attempts by Putin to prolong the war, meaning that as or if negotiations continue, there needs to be more force put on Putin to actually agree to a full ceasefire or face real consequences. But then in a little bit of breaking news, because as I was recording and editing this podcast today, I had to stop, come back down to the studio to tell you that Zelensky agreed to the 30-day partial ceasefire. He said on social media that there was a conversation he had with Trump about the conversation that Trump had had with Vladimir Putin, including something that I'll get to in a second here in what Trump wants for the United States in this deal. But Zelensky said that they are agreeing to this 30-day deal and are ready to implement it, seeming to say as soon as Russia does. Now, a little bit of irony here is that as Zelensky posted this online, air sirens were going off in different parts of Ukraine because drones were flying overhead ready to drop bombs. And while the White House has painted the Russian pitch of a ceasefire on energy infrastructure as concessions from Russia, that was before this bombing, they're not. They're actually in line with things that Russia has wanted for a long time. There's an old joke that Russia is just a potato farm connected to a gas station because Russia is an oil country. Their economy is built entirely around it. They're the second largest oil exporter in the world behind Saudi Arabia, and before the war, provided about a third of Europe's oil. Now, most, not all though, European countries pulled back from buying Russian oil after the invasion of Ukraine. The more authoritarian countries like Hungary or the far-right government of Poland, which are also, by the way, the ones who would be next on the list if Russia were to move beyond Ukraine, started buying more Russian oil in the summer of 2022 after the invasion. But for Putin to make sure that Russian oil and energy lines aren't bombed, that means that his country still has access to money to keep the war going, but really, it means that he gets to keep his own wealth and power. Putin was put in power by oligarchs, largely on the promise to them that they would get to make a lot of money, but only as long as they stayed loyal to him, and those who did, according to a report from NPR, were ATM machines for Putin and his allies to amass a lot of money. The others who didn't stay loyal were sent to prisons, were exiled, or died under mysterious circumstances. But if the money starts to dry up from those oligarchs because their pipelines are being bombed, Putin loses some of that power. Now, not all of it. He could definitely still disappear people, but the less money he makes, the weaker he gets, and the weaker the Russian army gets, because armies need oil. The oil is also why, really, Saudi Arabia is where peace talks are being held. Saudi Arabia is the largest exporter of oil in the world and the leader of what are called the OPEC nations. It's not important that you know what that acronym is for. Just know that this is a group of countries that control the price and essentially amount of oil that's on the open market. Russia isn't a part of that group, but they are a part of the group called OPEC Plus, which includes more countries that are also oil producers, maybe not full petro-state oil countries, but Russia certainly is one of those. So while, yes, Saudi Arabia in these talks is neutral ground, the U.S. would be too in effect, at least in the way that we're presenting ourselves on the world stage right now. But the only reason to hold these talks in the Middle East is because Saudi Arabia can put pressure on Russia and to a certain extent Ukraine when it comes to oil. Now, when we learn more about this deal that Trump is trying to make between Russia and Ukraine, we got two pretty striking revelations from the White House press briefing just this afternoon. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt danced around a few questions. The first one is that there's a lack of clarity on what Putin and Trump think they were talking about. The White House said it was Russia stopping bombing on energy and infrastructure, which could include things like roads, rail lines, communication lines, along with pipes and power plants. Russia, in its release, said it was energy infrastructure, so just the pipes and power plants. And in diplomacy like this, words matter. The White House said that their release was correct. But, like I said, Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary, danced around why there's this discrepancy and if there are plans to talk to Russia to clarify what each other means, because the difference between saying energy and infrastructure or energy infrastructure could be hundreds of lives lost in a bombing on a rail line or a highway in Ukraine. And right now, we don't have any clarity on why there's this discrepancy. Now, the other revelation, at least it was to me, I had not seen this reported anywhere else, is that Trump seems to have moved off of the deal for a $500 million cut of rare earth mineral rights in Ukraine, which is what was on the table when Zelensky was at the White House last month. That was the deal they were supposed to sign in order for more U.S. backing. Well, Trump has instead moved on to full ownership of oil and energy companies owned by Ukrainians to be owned by the U.S. Here's how Leavitt said it.
Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea on the way to a full ceasefire. They agreed this could be the first step toward the full end of the war and ensuring security. President Zelensky was grateful for the president's leadership in this effort and reiterated his willingness to adopt a full ceasefire. President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. He said that the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. President Zelensky.
So this got my attention for two reasons. First, it is super vague, and I'll go into why some of those vagaries matter, the details of the vagueness, if that's not an oxymoron, here in a second. But it really got my attention because this was, again, Trump pushing for another quid pro quo with Ukraine. It was the same kind of thing that got him impeached the first time around. And oddly enough, Leavitt actually brought up that deal with Ukraine in this press briefing. It was just a glancing blow at it, but it was still interesting for her to mention it. Now, if you don't remember what I'm talking about, because it's from 2019 and that might as well be 40 years ago, given how much news has happened, well, this was Trump trying to get Zelensky to dig up or make up damaging information about Joe Biden, his then campaign challenger, or Democrats as a whole in a conspiracy theory that never turned up anything. There were months of investigations by House Republicans, and they never found one shred of a so-called Biden crime family. But in exchange for this dirt, Trump was going to give Ukraine Javelin missiles that Ukraine needed to help beef up its defenses against what at the time was just the potential for a war with Russia. And now this isn't exactly the same. It's much closer to the rare earth mineral deal that Trump wanted to strike. But it's just as vague as that deal was too, because on this energy company deal, one, it's what Trump does. I've said it before, he operates transactionally. It's the only way he knows how to operate. And whether that's good foreign policy or not is something that people smarter than me in this area can and will debate. But what it does definitely do is give the U.S. skin in the game in a way that means we could also blow up this deal if Trump doesn't get what he wants. And because this just happened, like I said, this thing is really vague. We don't know what it means to have U.S. ownership of some of these companies. Are those American companies that are private, that are going to be given government contracts or access to buy these companies by the Ukrainian government? Is it the U.S. government getting in the oil game in Ukraine? And if that's the case, then what would happen there? There'd be a lot of international law that would need to be sifted through. It would take a long time for these companies to get changed over to whatever ownership structure these things would look like. And then, because there would be U.S. ownership in some form or fashion on the ground, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't be targets for future attacks or future incursions that Russia might want to make. So inevitably, there would need to be American security on the ground, likely in part military, and there's been no discussion about whether or not that's something the U.S. would need to provide, or if we would lean on our European allies, or what would happen. And the what would happen is the big worry in Europe right now. It's that Trump might get played by Putin into giving up Ukraine in exchange for something like these companies, and then they wouldn't know where the U.S. stands. Europe is already prepping for the U.S. to walk away from Ukraine, despite the ongoing negotiations and a need for the U.S. to stop Russia from invading more countries based on the agreements that we've made with allies. But the outlook isn't good right now. An expert with the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center, a nonprofit center that studies relationships with Russia and Eastern Europe, told the New York Times this week, the impression is that the Russians have a very, very, very good reading of Trump. They know where the weak spots are. They know how to massage his ego. To me, this expert said, the Russian team is winning at this point. So in the end, there are just a lot of questions still about what happens next. Peace talks are supposed to restart this Sunday in Saudi Arabia. Whether the recent round of bombing will affect that, we don't know. All we know is that several sides are coming together this weekend, and we'll see if that expert is right or wrong. Okay, that does it for today's midweek episode. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps boost this in people's feeds. Like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got new content going up there all the time. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. It's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today, and get ready for a much longer episode on Friday. I'll talk to you then.